Welcome to Chapter and Verse. This is Ray Dempsey, and I'd like to introduce you to my friend and classmate, Professor Raymond Sickinger from Providence College. He wrote an article which has received a lot of notice, and the article is entitled Hitler and the Occult, the Magical Thinking of Adolf Hitler. You know, the Adolf Hitler from World War II. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk about the Morning Mail, The Crucifixion of Jesus by Joseph Bergeron, a new book. It talks about what a medical doctor thinks. Joseph Bergeron is a medical doctor, and he examines the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's also another book which I've been wanting to talk about, but I hadn't until now, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. It is the classic guide to understanding the opposite sex. So, without further ado, let's talk about Hitler and the occult, the magical thinking. You know, I was saying before our taping, our recording today, that I didn't think that Hitler was beyond the bounds of normal reasoning. I thought, you know, he had accomplished so much, and he was known to be a fiery speaker, working in thoughts and words and things. I didn't realize that he may have been at the mercy of magical thinking. But he may have been.
He may well have been, yes. He was an interesting figure, though he was opposed, Ray, to the idea that some of his compatriots had, people like Himmler and Hess, in terms of the occult. He himself had a superstitious side, a very real superstitious side, and most importantly, he had what some psychologists call the most important element of what's called magical thinking. Magical thinking has nothing to do with illusionists and the kinds of things we normally associate with magic. What magical thinking involves is the idea that somehow if I really will something, it will happen. And in fact, if it doesn't happen, it's because something has come in place to obstruct my will. So I need to persist in willing something. And definitely Hitler had that component throughout most of his life, and in fact, it intensified. In addition to that, he really believed that he was sent by God to do God's work.
Really?
He really thought that God had given him a mission. Part of what contributed to that was the fact that in World War I, he was a messenger runner. Now, the life expectancy of a messenger runner was pretty short on the Western Front in World War I, but Hitler survived.
Yes.
There were numerous times he survived events. For example, there was one time he was sitting with a group of people, and he just got this, he called it intuition, this message that he had to move. And he moved, and several seconds later, a bomb hit, killed everyone in that group other than Hitler. And so there were numerous instances like that that we would call perhaps coincidences or luck, but he saw them as God watching out for him, and most importantly, sending him on a mission. So he had this real sense of a divine mission as well. Interestingly, however, his divine mission ended up being quite contrary to what I think God, and particularly the Son of God, Jesus Christ, would in fact want.
What was Hitler's idea of God?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind after many years of study that Hitler himself did believe in a God.
Yeah.
But there is also no doubt in my mind, even though he was raised Catholic, and a number of, not all, but a number of Nazi officials were Catholic, even though he was raised Catholic, he did not believe eventually in the Christian God. There is no doubt of that in my mind. In fact, what he was moving towards more and more was an ancient Teutonic religion. That's what he was moving towards. And in fact, the only difference was that Hitler believed very strongly that Christianity would gradually die out, and he was going to allow it to die what he called a death over time. But followers of his, like Himmler and Rosenberg, they wanted to extirpate Christianity and Christians, especially the Catholic Church, as quickly as possible. So there was definitely within the Nazi Party a real antipathy to Christianity in general, Catholicism in particular, and there really was a movement to end the influence of Christianity and the Catholic Church, as well as the Protestant Church in Germany eventually.
I find this discussion to be important, Ray, because I think people, as the younger generation grows older, and may be looking for guide rails and guidance, I think we're losing an important object lesson for the masses once we lose sight of the historical event of the Third Reich. We're getting to the point where people don't know about it anymore. So we have an example, a practical example, where we can examine the nature of evil in a modern, westernized, very sophisticated culture, and how a modern Western culture could be turned into a death machine.
Yes. You know, it's so very, very interesting, Ray. We would like to think that the Nazis were monsters.
Yes.
And we oftentimes hear those things. And I always remember reading Fanya Fenelon's diary. Fanya Fenelon was a Jewish woman, a cabaret singer. She wasn't a practicing Jew, but she was Jewish. And she was in Paris, and all of a sudden she found herself rounded up and on a train to Auschwitz.
Wow.
And at Auschwitz, Fanya Fenelon literally played for time by playing in the camp band because she was talented.
Right.
And it really caused tremendous problems for her because she was torn. You know, she would play for the Nazi commandants and she would play for those who were arriving, but it helped her survive. But at one point she was talking to the other women in the camp band and they're saying, oh, these Nazis are monsters. And she says, no. She says, the problem is they're human beings.
Yes.
And they're treating other human beings despicably. And she says, and that's the problem. We're learning something about human nature.
Yes.
And it's not good news.
Yes. At the Eichmann's trial, Hitler wanted to kill the Jews, but he didn't want to do it himself one by one.
That's right.
So he appointed one of his subordinates, a fellow by the name of Adolf Eichmann, to do the job. And Eichmann took the job very seriously, and he eventually fled Germany and avoided the Nuremberg trials, the United States Army War Crimes Tribunal. But he hid out in South America, where he was kidnapped by the government of Israel and brought to trial in Jerusalem for his work on what was then called the Final Solution. And there was a courtroom drama that took place. There was a man who was a witness to Eichmann's work, his deeds, and he fled the scene in great haste, and he may have even exclaimed something. A reporter followed him out and said, "Why are you having this response?" And he said, "Is it because you saw the monster in him?" And he said, no, it's quite different than that. He said, Eichmann was a man of manners and politeness. He was an example of kindness and manners. He said, I guess the point of what he was trying to say is that the demon wasn't a monstrosity. It was a genteel man who was capable of killing 12 million people.
It is. You know, Ray, it's amazing. One of the things that I've recently taught with my students is the Wannsee protocol. And the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942, Eichmann was there, Reinhard Heydrich was there, and head of one of the most important people in the Sicherheitsdienst of the SS. And there's these group of individuals, and over cocktails and food, they discuss for about an hour and a half how they are going to deal with the Jewish problem. And they come up finally with the final solution to the Jewish question, which is not only extermination, but extermination in a systematic way through using gas, eventually Cyclone B gas. And what is absolutely amazing about reading that document, and there's been a very fine film with Kenneth Branagh on it called Conspiracy, one of the most important things about that document is the business-like character of the whole thing, as if this is just another mathematical problem. And what I've learned is that there's something that happens where average people, common people, who in another life were what we might call decent people,
Gentlemen,
end up doing the most extreme atrocities. Just the other day, we were reading in the Western Civ seminar that I run, a wonderful book by a woman named Wendy Lauer. It's called Hitler's Furies. And what absolutely amazed me, it came out in 2013, what absolutely amazed me is that Wendy Lauer has completely changed how we think of women and their response. Because what she demonstrates is that secretaries, nurses, teachers, and also the wives of SS were oftentimes actively engaged in helping the Holocaust occur, or the final solution, whichever term you prefer to use. And we don't think of this as something a woman would do. So again, it's common, ordinary people in the kinds of positions we take for granted in society. So the human person is capable of incredible good, but the human person is also capable of incredible evil.
we're seeing some parallels in our lives today in the news. The other day, the Senate, the United States Senate, voted not to protect the lives of innocent children who were the product of a botched abortion. There are about 365 babies born every year from abortion. Now, if they're tended to, some of them are hurt very badly by the abortion. Some of them aren't. And if they're attended to, they tend to live. It's a major problem because the abortionist may be charged with a wrongful life suit, and he may have to pay the expenses of the child for 18 years. Mm-hmm. So there is an economic motivation to end the life of the child. And so there's a lot of abortionists who want to just quickly dispatch the child through whatever means is available. And we're seeing that sort of thing now. We saw it before Hitler took off. When Hitler was a corporal, recovering from a war wound in World War I, there was a book, or a pamphlet, better said, called "The Release of the Destructiveness of Life Devoid of Meaning or Value" by two people, Haka and Binding. Mm-hmm. And they said that there's a destructiveness in the lives of handicapped people, and we can release that destructiveness by killing them.
Yes. Well, you know, it's interesting what you bring up, and these are obviously very important and also very difficult issues. But what I can tell you from the work that I've done in the period is that there developed really a culture of death in the Nazi world. And what you're referring to is extremely important. For example, the Nazis engaged in what was called the T4 program.
T4.
And the T4 program actually led eventually to the techniques that were going to be used in the Holocaust later on, the gassing. Because what they did is, during the war and leading up to the war period, those with significant disabilities, particularly mental disabilities, were considered to be useless eaters. That's how they were referred to. And therefore a drain on society, non-productive citizens. So what they began to systematically do is to go around with vans where there was carbon monoxide. They would put the people in the vans. The larger number of people, the better it was, because it was quicker and more effective. And then they would leave the vans running and they would die of carbon monoxide gas. This extraordinary disregard for human life in general.
Yes.
The fact that people are placed into categories. So, for example, there are inferior peoples.
Yes.
Slavic peoples and so forth. The Jewish people, they're actually at the lowest rung. They're actually considered to be an anti-race. One of the most ironic things is that though Jews were persecuted throughout history, throughout much of history, there was always an escape clause. If a Jew converted to Christianity, they probably wouldn't be persecuted anymore. But there was no escape clause in Nazi Germany because they weren't being persecuted because of their religious beliefs. They were being persecuted because they were considered to be this anti-race.
A genetic inferiority.
Genetic inferiority. And so you have all of these divisions where people are not created equal. It's just not within the Nazi doctrine and the Nazi thought. In addition to that, you have all of these conditions for German people as well. Never mind, Jews and Slavic peoples and so forth, because even within Nazi Germany, from 1933, July of 1933, there was a law against hereditable diseases, which meant that if you had one of those hereditable diseases, you had to be sterilized. So you could not have children. And it was not a long distance after that that even those that had some of those diseases would be considered for termination as well. Or, for example, the doctors' experiments that occurred with Mengele and the camps and so forth, some of them particularly on twins, children who were twins, because from a doctor's standpoint, you'd have a wonderful, stable sample here to compare what you're doing. It's just, it's just an enormous, enormous degradation of human life, and it's a recognition of others as not being equal. And it goes so counter to Christian doctrine. It goes counter to most religious doctrine in that regard.
Hitler was interested in the work of Margaret Sanger.
Yes.
He sent an emissary to Margaret Sanger, an emissary whose name was Ernst Ruden. Mm-hmm. And she had ideas of eugenics and sterilization.
Yes.
And I don't really remember if she had an interest in abortion. Mm. I just don't remember.
Yeah, I don't recall whether she does, but I do know that a number of the ideas, those that certainly she would hold, led to two kinds of things. In terms of eugenics, those who study eugenics talk about positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics means you try to encourage the best to breed. And so in Nazi Germany, what they would do is they would actually identify young women with good and proper racial characteristics. They would identify young men the same way. They would encourage them to breed and then give the child over to the state to raise. That's called Lebensborn, the Lebensborn program.
Yes.
Again, no marriage. They obviously encouraged large families and so forth, but a lot of people don't know about that Lebensborn program, which was just a pure breeding program that went on. Now, on the other side, what some who write about it call negative eugenics, they also took steps to prevent breeding. And that is sterilization, forced sterilization of a number of people with different kinds of characteristics. So if, for example, there was a German person and they had maybe a club foot or something of that sort, they would probably be sterilized. Ironically, Joseph Goebbels had a club foot.
Isn't that interesting?
But never was placed under those restrictions.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I hear that there was an organization called the Children's Charitable Trust, which was an ambulance, or like an ambulance,
Yes.
and they would collect children with slight deformities, a misshapen ear,
Yes.
and they would euthanize the children.
Yes. Yes, I wish I could say that that wasn't true. In fact, there's one story in Wendy Laura's book where she says one teacher ended up being horrified because she had this young girl who had epilepsy in her class. And eventually found out that the principal turned that child over, and the child was never seen again. And the teacher assumed that the child was taken away and euthanized.
This is before Hitler, isn't it?
No, this was actually during Hitler's reign. Although there were currents in the air. You bring up a very good point by your question, and that is sadly, nothing that Hitler said or believed in or endorsed was new thinking.
Yeah.
What he did was take a number of currents that had been in the air, anti-Semitic thinking about eugenics and racial differences and so forth, and brings them together in what's a coherent and very sadly coherent system that is terribly destructive.
Yes. Yes. So there was a death machine, a death culture, and he just took the wheel.
That's exactly right. And he had a number of accomplices willing to do that at various levels. And then on the lower levels, what you begin to see is that though a number of people are reluctant to go along with this culture of death, over time, people get acclimated to things.
Oh, I'm afraid you're right.
And that's exactly what happens. You see it even with some of those. A man named Browning, Christopher Browning, wrote a book called Ordinary Men. It talks about this one police battalion that a number of the people in there were brought out with the Einsatzgruppen to go out and to shoot Jews, which was the first step before the final solution, which was the gassing and so forth. And he said that initially, a number of those men really were, upset. Some of them actually got sick doing this.
Wow.
But over time, they adjusted to it. And in fact, one of the biggest reasons they adjusted is because they felt they had a sense of duty to the state. And the second reason was they didn't want to let their comrades down. They didn't want to look like a coward. And so over time, ordinary people who initially were really upset about what they were doing began to adjust to the whole process. And so ordinary men became ordinary killers.
Which is concerning to me, because we have this culture of death in America today, in abortion and now infanticide. There is a great response to it, thank goodness. There's a lot of people now who were pro-choice a year ago who are pro-life now. We don't know what's going to happen in the next election, but we'll be watching.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the real danger is, and I think this is the real danger. The real danger is people don't reflect about things. We're so busy in our lives. And I mention this because these are some of the very things that people bring up in this period of time about the war that I've been speaking to you about. So, for example, Albert Speer, in his memoirs, he says, I really fault myself. He says, I don't want to be exonerated. I fault myself.
Yeah.
He says, what happened was, I did not take the time to reflect deeply on what I was doing or what the Nazi state was doing. He says, I was so caught up in the everyday work that I was doing that I didn't take time to think. And he said, and the Nazi state didn't encourage you to think.
Yes.
And so he said, I let things go by I should never have let go by as a person. And he says, and I'm not making an excuse.
No.
He says, I should have reflected more deeply.
There seems to be no accountability. The manufacturer of Cyclone B gas is IG Farben.
IG Farben Chemical Company, absolutely.
They're still in existence.
Oh, yes. In fact, there were really no serious repercussions. And in fact, a very interesting line of scholarship that's developed in the past 10 years or so in the whole field of the Nazi era is, in fact, the complicity of many businesses with the Nazi government. Many of the particular companies also made use of slave labor. Fritz Sauckel and others would take some of the people from concentration camps, some of the Jews that were healthier, and they would be slave labor. Eventually, they would be worked to death. But there was a whole slave labor thing that went on as well.
Somebody told me that IG Farben held the patent for Bayer aspirin.
It could very well. I'm not sure of that, but it could very well. It was a major chemical company. And IG Farben Chemical Company, Zyklon B gas, was gas intended to kill insects. That's what it was intended for.
Yes. Well, you've got a wonderful article here. You know, one of my dear friends is the late Dr. Joseph Stanton, assistant clinical professor of medicine at Tufts University. Mm-hmm. And he did an interview on chapter and verse. Many years ago, he interviewed Dr. Leo Alexander, a psychiatrist and a Jew, who was an official observer from the United States to the United States Army War Crimes Tribunal, otherwise known as the Nuremberg trials, where a lot of the Nazis were put on trial. And Joseph asked Dr. Alexander, how did something like this happen? And Dr. Alexander said, it happened when we in society agreed that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be continued.
Yes. I don't think he's wrong, Ray, because as I said before, that is really a fundamental premise of the Nazis. It's not just anti-democratic, which it is.
Yeah.
In other words, all people aren't created equal. It goes even beyond the democratic side. What they really mean is that all people are not created equal, and they go a step further, because there have been other governments that say all people aren't created equal, but they don't necessarily kill people.
Yeah.
But they said all people are not created equal, and some are not worthy of living. Well, and that's the real danger.
Hitler seemed to believe in Darwinism. When Darwinism first, evolutionary Darwinism first took root, there was a social Darwinism attached to it. It was a racist polemic.
Yeah.
And Hitler seemed to believe that.
Oh, absolutely. In the 19th century, Darwin's ideas were taken by several people. The most important one was Herbert Spencer, started with Herbert Spencer. And Spencer developed what's called social Darwinism that you remarked on a moment ago. And social Darwinism basically takes the ideas of Darwin that's meant to be...
Ray, we're running on it. We have a few seconds left. May we pick up on this very idea for next week's program?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to do it.
Thank you for joining us.